Yeah. Family, y'all. Just keep it tight, keep it tight, keep it tight. Oh, right. Yeah. Here we go.
What's the context within which Jesus proclaimed? So we have to put this within this larger eschatological context, because Jesus was not the first person on earth to believe that the end was coming, that the kingdom of God was breaking into history. The prophets, the Israelites, had long been looking forward to God breaking in. Remember the stories of when we were in exile, for instance? You know, here we are in misery, in exile, deported from our homeland. Wouldn't it be nice if God broke in the same way that God's broken into our history in the past? Remember when the Israelites were in slavery? What happened? God broke into history. So the Israelites were waiting for God to break into history again. 4 periods of Israel's eschatology. The first period is the patriarchs. Have we heard of them before? The patriarchs are people like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. So back about that period, this concept of the reign of God, or of the reigning God, was manifest in Yahweh's mighty acts on behalf of Israel. So that, for instance, with God leading us through the Red Sea, right? There's this notion of how it is that God is breaking into history and God is leading us forward. Leading us forward toward this promised land. So these notions of eschatology are rooted back in that experience of God leading us toward this future that awaits us. There's a future orientation where God is luring us into the future. Remember back to our course in ancient philosophy, we talked about how it is that in the end, there's sort of like this teleological end, and we're all being drawn toward the end. How interesting that there's this future orientation with eschatology as well, where God is drawing us into the future, into this unknown land. God called Abram, who later became Abraham, to do what? To go to an unknown land. God took the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. Where? Into an unknown land. This idea of God drawing us out into the unknown. Where this God, or this future then, is a moving target, or we don't know. God is drawing us into the future, but do you know what that future means for you? Do you know what you're going to be doing next year or the year after that? So there's sort of like this concept of God drawing us into this future that's unknown, where we walk by faith. We just have to trust that God is leading us where we need to be. So the patriarchs, that was the first era of our history in terms of eschatology, where we first got this sense of God drawing us toward this unknown future. The second stage of our history is with the monarchs, the kings, Saul and David, King Saul and King David, around the year 1000, where the God of Israel's history is now fused with the King of creation. So we take this God that we've already believed in, this God who led us out of slavery, and now the stories that we have of creation, where do they date to? This time period, roughly. This time period or even later. So now we start seeing God as the King of creation who created the world. The pagans, they have their beliefs that their gods created the world. Did their gods create our world? I have a feeling that we need to have our own beliefs in that respect, right? How it is that our God created this world. So during that time period, creation, we saw creation as God's first mighty act, which is why, how does the Bible begin? The Bible begins with the story of creation. Genesis 1 and 2. How does the Bible begin? Creation. What was God's first act? What was the first thing that God did? God created the world. God created the world. That was God's first act. And it's at this time that we start coming to this idea of monotheism, which simply means how many gods do we believe in? One. So before when we say we talked about Baal, the king of creation, wait a minute. Do we have two gods? Do we have their gods and our God? What solution do we come up with? There's only one God. There's only one God. So the first hints of monotheism date to slightly after this period, to Deutero-Isaiah and the Babylonian exile. There's the prophetic period, the period of the prophets, where the prophets begin speaking about the final decisive ruling act of Yahweh, the Malkuth Yahweh. So what Jesus was preaching actually dates to the prophets. Jesus didn't make up this kingdom of God language. Jesus actually was preaching what the prophets had already, this concept the prophets had already been forming. Where in the future, God is going to bring creation to completion. Think about that for a moment. Is anything on earth perfect? No. But in the end, what's going to happen when God is all in all? God is going to make us all perfect. Think about the consequence of this for a moment. So when Isaiah, during this period, started prophesying about these end times, what's he going to say then? When God is all in all, when we make creation complete, what's going to happen with the deaf person? The person who currently can't hear? Is the deaf person going to still be deaf at the end of time? No, the deaf will hear. What about the blind? Will the blind still be blind at the end of time when all creation is all in all? No, they'll be restored. The blind will see. The lame, right? Back then we didn't have wheelchairs. Imagine what it would have been like to be lame back in that era. I mean, if you were lame, you were stationary, right? At the end of time, is God going to allow us, when God is all in all, are there going to be lame people in our presence? No. All creation is going to be restored by this final decisive act of God breaking into this world, the reigning God, the Malkuth Yahweh. When God is all in all reigning in this world, then creation will be brought to completion. And the prophets, the expression that the prophets used for that day is they would say, and on that day. So that if you look up in any Bible program online, or if you even Google on that day, there are all sorts of Bible passages which talk about when they're talking about the coming Messiah or the reign of God. On that day. What's going to happen on that day? On that day, the lion is going to lie down with the cow, and the bear with the kid, and the rattlesnake and the child are going to be friends. It's sort of like, whoa. When are all these things going to happen? When all of creation is complete. And so there are no longer going to be these enmities between various animals or between animals and humans. You know what? We're all going to be living together in peace. That was the vision that the prophets had. The prophet Isaiah had this vision where we're all going to be living in peace, so do we need swords anymore? Will we need swords if we're all living in peace? What does the prophet Isaiah say? We're going to take our swords and beat them into plowshares. I mean, what a vision for when the kingdom of God comes to this world, when the reigning God breaks into this world, all creation is going to be restored and all of us will live in peace. Wow. All walls will be broken down. There will be no enemies. No enmity between people. In the prophetic period, it was during this time that we believed that Yahweh would bring the world to the state that Yahweh intended it to be. So God created the world. Okay, we know that. God created the world. But what happened shortly after God created the world? Genesis 2 tells us that God created the world and we screwed it up. Right? Sin entered the world. And so there's this, creation is not complete yet. Sin has some rule over the world, but in the end of time, when God is all in all, there has to be some victory over sin. And there has to be some victory over death as well. If God is truly God of all and reigning, then this reigning God is going to conquer everything, including sin and including death. Various images are found there of what that state's going to look like one day. We call them paradisal symbols of paradise. What would it look like if we were to imagine what the kingdom of God is going to be like? Well, he says, for instance, we're going to beat our swords into plowshares, Isaiah 2, chapter 2, verse 4. How it is that the wolf would be the guest of the lamb. You mean the wolf is not going to eat the lamb? You don't put wolves together with lambs, people. You don't do that. Why not? Because the wolf is going to eat the lamb. What is Isaiah saying, though? One day, there's going to, all of the enmity will be no more. They're going to be living in peace with one another. You and your mother-in-law or your daughter-in-law or that other in-law or whoever, that brother, that sister who drives you crazy, you know what? One day, when creation is all in all and God is reigning completely, y'all are going to be living in peace. It was Isaiah's vision. So centuries before the coming of Christ, they were already having this vision of what the perfect world would be like. And that perfect world didn't have us killing cows or wolves killing sheep or rattlesnakes killing babies or anything like that. No, wait a minute. Where we're all living in peace with all the creation. Yahweh would be fully revealed and victorious over creation. So God is just beginning to break into the world in the person of Jesus. But one day, God is going to be fully revealed. The curtain is going to be drawn back, and we're going to see God. The book of Revelation, what is the book of Revelation all about? It's about revealing what's going to happen in the end times. It's about the eschaton. The other word that we use for the eschaton is the apocalypse. At the end of time, what is it going to be like? Revelation reveals that. The English word reveal comes from the word veil, right? It's pulling the veil or the curtain back so we can see what's behind the curtain. Right now, we can't tell what's going to happen in the future. They pull back the curtain to give us some idea of what's going to happen. It's at that time that the Malkuth Yahweh is used to express how it is that Yahweh will be when Yahweh is fully victorious over creation. What does Isaiah say? The blind will see, the lame will walk, injustices will be defeated, sins will be forgiven, because when all of creation is restored to perfection, we can't have blind people and lame people and deaf people. It's not going to happen. Think of the loved ones we've known who've lost health in one way or another. You know what? On the final day, they're going to be fully restored. And our bodies will be raised. That was the Jewish belief that was arising during this time. If God is truly going to be victorious and God is powerful over everything, then God's got to be powerful over death too. Yahweh's final reigning act will be the restoration of creation, the restoring of all creation. And so it's more of a this-worldly eschatology, which simply means it's not talking about some heaven far, far away. For the Jews, it was going to be God's kingdom coming to this world. What was Jesus' prayer? Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom. What? Come. It's not about us going to God's kingdom. It's about God's kingdom breaking into this world. It's a this-worldly eschatology. The world ends here. It's not about us going out to some heaven light years away. It's about us being and living in peace when all of creation here is brought to its perfection. So Isaiah set us down this road of thinking about the end of the world in a certain way. Jesus was an heir of all of that. Jesus knew the scriptures, knew the prophets. But then about 150 to 170 years before Jesus was born, there becomes this new turn with these apocalyptic seers. And interestingly, the timing is such that it's about the time of the Maccabean revolt and the restoration of the temple. So during the same time period, we have these people who claim to be able to see into the future, and what they see isn't very bright. They're seeing this image of how it is that there's going to be like this cataclysmic battle, if you will. Have you read the book of Revelation? It talks about horsemen coming in and slaying people and monsters rising up out of the seas and a clash between heaven and earth. It's scary. Well, those beliefs date back to this time period. 170 or 150 BC is when these less optimistic seers start speaking about this transformation and this cosmic catastrophe where there's going to be a new heavens and a new earth. And when all of this takes place, then we have to be raised from the dead, which is why around this time there becomes a belief in the resurrection. The resurrection is simply the belief that if God is going to be all in all one day, if there's going to be this reigning God reigning over all of creation, then God has got to be victorious over everything, including death. But what does that mean for that person who has died? God is going to be victorious over death. That person is going to be raised. If God is really God, then that person is going to be raised. God will be victorious over even death. And so, when Jesus started raising people from the dead, in the stories that come to us in the gospel, what happens when Jesus starts raising people from the dead? That's crazy. God's kingdom, the reigning God, is breaking into this world through Jesus. Not even death has the final word. They say everything is certain. The two things that you can be certain about in life are what? Death and taxes. Really, the only thing you can be certain about are taxes. Why? Because as Christians, death is not a certainty. Follow me? If you believe in a reigning God who will be all in all at the end of time, then this belief in resurrection means that death is not certain. That God will raise our mortal bodies to be like his own in glory. And Jesus raising people from the dead was an anticipation of that.
Well, I guess we'll just include the Jews there.
We're listening to the Jews, yes.
So if God is going to overcome all of these obstacles that we ourselves have placed in our culture or thoughts, then the Jews, now the Christians, and the cows, and everything, we're going to be able to transcend all that. So if we're all, as human beings, included in that, and we don't have the limited number of positions or seats in heaven, then there's really very little that is excluded. And if God is God, then we cannot exclude other beings, not human, and not of this world.
God will bring all creation together in God's self. There's no barriers. Jesus is God, is a God that doesn't say, oh, you Gentiles are excluded. Prostitutes, tax collectors, women, we could set up all sorts of false barriers and exclude people. What is Jesus' message? That's not God. That is not God. For God to be God, all in all, and drawing all creation to God's self, drawing all creation to God's self, that means women and Gentiles and prostitutes and tax collectors and cows and whatever else that's part of creation, drawing it all together to God's self. It's a very inclusive vision of God's kingdom. Jesus' vision clashed with the vision of the Pharisees because they believed that the way that they were getting their salvation, a very Pelagian view, was by works, by following the law. If I follow the law, I will earn God's love and I will earn salvation. I am following the law so that I can enjoy heaven. Is that what Jesus preached? No.
But Father, that doesn't limit us to this time or the time where these people, when they live. I expect that since it's all in all, then we're talking about future times, future generations, as well as past times and past generations. People who did not have the, human beings who lived and did not have the benefit of this knowledge or thought process. That being the case, that is universal.
It's suggesting that God could draw non-Christians to God's self? Karl Rahner, the notion that he came up with was anonymous, that the anonymous Christian, or anonymous Christians, simply meaning, you know what? You don't have to be Christian for God to draw you to God's self. Because if you are a good person of whatever religion or of no religion, there's no reason to think that God would not draw you to God. When God draws all of creation to God's self, sorry, but you're part of creation. Regardless of who you are, where you came from, how you lived your life this week, who you love, etc. Sorry, God is drawing all creation to God's self. So the prophets, during this period, we see this eschatology of how it is then that God is going to draw all creation to God's self and be victorious over all. If God is God, then God must be victorious over all. God must be triumphant over all, because if not, then there's something greater than God. Can anything be greater than God? Can death be greater than God? No. It has to be the other way around. God is greater than death. God is greater than any division, any enmity, any hatred, any feeling in this world. God's bigger than all that.